Thank you again, everyone, for joining. We have a few guests here in person as well. Let me introduce myself. My name is Alexander Aquino. I'm a resident of South Pasadena, and I am the newest member of Care First. I want to talk about two things before we dive into the information about the report. The first thing I want to do is share a story with you. I recently joined a gym near where the 110 meets the 5, and on two occasions, on my way home, while getting onto the 110 freeway, I've seen an unhoused woman and her daughter. Her daughter is about my daughter's age. As I was turning the corner, the daughter was reaching out and consoling the mother, who was feeling sad. It almost felt like a scripted moment, but it couldn't have been, because I literally just turned the corner and was getting onto the freeway and they were there. And for the first time, really, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but for the first time, I saw this unhoused parent and her child and thought, they're just like me. I'm a parent. I have a daughter. There's no difference. We're just people getting by, trying to figure out how to live, how to have food, water, a safe place to sleep. We know homelessness in the city, in LA, in the state, in the country is bad. There's a lot right now. And smarter people than me have better ideas on how to fix it. But I know one thing. Those ideas require money. They require funding. And that's something we're going to talk about today in this report, about funding that's being allocated to police departments instead of towards programs that can assist unhoused people like this mother and daughter that I've seen. The second thing I want to bring up today is that today is 2 years since Anthony McLean was shot in the back by Pasadena police officers. Running away from a traffic stop, police officers shot him in the back unjustly. This is one of the reasons why I am a member of Care First. We do the work every day to try and push our local politicians, our elected officials, our city councils to reimagine public safety and to do it in a way that can be non-lethal. That is important, especially on a day like today, but every day. So let me tell you a little bit about Care First South Pasadena. We are a coalition of residents. We volunteer our time and we work very hard to reimagine public safety. And one of our missions is to reallocate city dollars to reflect our community's priorities. We came together in the summer of 2020, just after George Floyd's murder, and amid a global pandemic, with a desire for a more just and inclusive community. You can find us at carefirstsouthpasadena.com and on Instagram at carefirstsouthpas. Now I'd like to introduce Ella, who's one of the founding members of Care First. She's going to talk to you a little bit about the inception of this report. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks folks for coming in person and for joining us on Zoom. Alexander mentioned we started this group in summer 2020. We spent a while organizing and realized that one of the main problems we had was a lack of information about how the police department works, what they're doing. A large chunk of the city budget goes to policing, and there's not as much information about how that money is spent. So one of the ways that we decided to get at that was to send some Public Records Act requests to the city and ask for information that are, public records under California law. We did that in, I want to say, February 2021. We got a number of records back from the city. And then we spent maybe 6 months going back and forth about, can we get additional records? This is missing, that's missing. We noticed right away that the records were all in image PDF files, which are not usable. And that all Hispanic arrestees had been coded as white, or virtually all. So we went through a process to try to get more information, and ultimately we got what we got, and we decided it was time to do something with it. Professor Harris and Professor Rodnyansky, I think I'm saying that right, from Occidental, had worked with advocates in Glendale and published a really great report out of Glendale about Glendale policing. So we approached them to see if they would be able to use our data, knowing that within our small coalition, we don't have a ton of expertise in data analysis, crunching numbers. And they were willing to take all these unreadable image files and convert them and start working with them. So we had a few initial meetings just to say, here are some of the things we're interested in learning, if possible, from this data. and let us know what you find. And then we met more recently to sort of go over the findings, but the findings really are an independent analysis of the data that we got from the city. There's no sort of political agenda in the analysis, if that makes sense. So back to Alexander to introduce our speaker.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce Jorgen Harris. Jorgen is an assistant professor of economics at Occidental College, where we are today. He holds a PhD in economics from Cornell University. His research spans several areas related to social and economic inequality, including the role of workplace diversity on hiring decisions, the effect of public policy on parenting, and the effectiveness of educational programs in correctional facilities. Prior to working at Occidental College, Jorgen worked at the Census Bureau, so did I actually for a little bit, at MDRC and at Auburn Correctional Facility as an economics instructor.
All right, first of all, I just want to again thank everyone for being here, both the people in person and the people on Zoom. It is really gratifying to be able to share the work that we've done. And I'm really looking forward to fielding all of your questions and helping to get a joint understanding of this work. Before I dive into what we did, I want to acknowledge the people who made this work possible, starting with my fantastic co-author and collaborator, Sieva Rodnyansky. Sieva would love to be here right now, but his baby daughter is 2 weeks old, so he's a little bit busy right now. But he's been absolutely instrumental in all of this work. I also want to thank our student partners in this, Jazz Henry, Delphi Drake Muede, Rayhan Chowdhury, and Alexis Martinez. As you've heard, this data came to us with a lot of messiness and difficulty, and our students were instrumental in helping us turn what we got from the city and from the police department into usable data. And so I'm incredibly grateful to them for their work. And I also want to say how grateful I am to Care First South Pasadena as a whole, and especially to Helen and Ella. Care First has been a fantastic partner in this work, both in going through all of the incredible difficulty of getting us this data, but also helping us understand the local context of South Pasadena. So the first thing that I want to do is just talk a little bit about what I'm going to be showing you today and what we saw as our role in this process. So as you've heard, the data that we're analyzing come from a Freedom of Information Act request filed by Care First South Pasadena. The data include arrest records for the last 10 years and dispatch records from the end of 2016. So essentially what we have is every person who was arrested by the South Pasadena Police Department since 2012, information on those arrests, and we have information about police activity starting in 2017. The way that we understood our role here, right? Our goal in producing this report, as Ella's already said, was to provide a common basis of understanding, a common set of facts that could be used by all members of the South Pasadena community. So our goal here is to provide purely descriptive evidence, right? To tell you what the South Pasadena Police Department has been doing in order to facilitate a more productive discussion about what the South Pasadena Police Department ought to do in the future and about how the resources of South Pasadena ought to be used in the future, right? So my goal here is just to tell you what we know from this information about what has actually happened. And please interrupt me throughout with questions if anything is unclear to you. So I'm going to walk you through, before I dive into the muck of this, I want to just give you the key findings. So in case anybody loses track over the course of this, you understand the big picture. So the first thing that I want to point out is that the number of arrests per year has declined considerably over this time period, right? From 2012 to 2021. South Pasadena Police Department conducts about fewer than half as many arrests as they did at the beginning of this time period. This is exactly in line with what we see from the Los Angeles Police Department. In fact, the arrests per capita in South Pasadena are exactly the same as the arrests per capita in Los Angeles. I want to point out as well that while police dispatches, right, police activity declined over this time period as well, the decline in police dispatches was much smaller than the decline in arrests. So we see that fewer interactions with police are resulting in arrest at the end of our time period than did in 2017. I also want to note that South Pasadena has very few arrests for violent crime. I noted before that the arrests per capita are exactly the same as in Los Angeles, right, as in the LAPD, but violent crime arrests are less than half what they are in Los Angeles, right, which probably isn't going to surprise anybody. So this is happening in a context of a relatively low crime environment, and a very small percentage of police activity results in a serious arrest, an arrest for a felony or arrest for a violent crime. Fewer than 1 in 300 dispatches in a felony arrest, 1 in 600 in arrest for violent crime. And the last really important thing to note is that when we look at this data, we see very large disproportionality in the rate of arrest for Black and Hispanic individuals by the South Pasadena Police relative to the population of South Pasadena. In fact, we see a greater disproportionality in arrests in South Pasadena than we do in either of the other two police departments where we have similar data. It's more disproportionate than Glendale, more disproportionate than Los Angeles. The last thing that we want to note is when we look at where police activity is happening, discretionary police activity seems to be centered in commercial areas in South Pasadena, particularly in a handful of locations like Bond's grocery store. So that's basically what I'm going to show you. And I'm going to show you the same thing, but in a little bit more detail. And I want to start out by just walking you through the characteristics and trends in arrests and dispatches over this time period. The first thing I want you to see here is exactly what I pointed out before. We have basically arrests per 1,000 residents in South Pasadena, Los Angeles, and Glendale, where South Pasadena is the darker orange line. Right, and what you can see is that in 2012, all three cities arrested people at a very similar rate relative to their population. Over the following 10 years, arrests per capita fell considerably in Los Angeles and South Pasadena to less than half the level that they were initially. And they didn't fall everywhere, right? They did not fall in Glendale. They didn't fall nearly as much in the LA Sheriff's Department. So the first thing that we're seeing here is that the trend in arrests in South Pasadena is very much in line with what we see in Los Angeles. Now, if we think about what to make of this decline in arrests, there's a couple things that might be happening. One thing that might be happening is that this is reflecting a decline in arrestable activities or criminal activities happening in South Pasadena. Another possibility is that this is representing a difference in the decisions police officers make when confronted with a situation about whether or not to arrest someone. So we've done a couple things to try to untangle this. The first thing we've done is we've looked at the number of police dispatches. This is essentially, South Pasadena produces a media log every day with all of the times that police officers were sent to deal with a situation, right? Or sent out into the field. What we can see is that those dispatches have also fallen. They've fallen by about 20% from 2017 to 2021. But that decline is much smaller than the decline in arrests. So the likelihood of being arrested, given a police dispatch, has fallen by about 50% over this time period. The next thing we want to ask is what kind of arrests are experiencing this decline, right? If we saw this decline primarily in violent crimes or in serious arrests, the likely conclusion would be that there's a reduction in crime over this time period. If we see the reduction in discretionary arrests, that makes it more like, or arrests for less serious crimes, that makes it more likely that this is a reaction to state policy like Prop 47, right? Reducing the penalties for low-level property and drug crime or change in policing tactics. What we actually see when we look at the data is that while the number of arrests for felonies did decline over this time period, most of the decline in arrests came from misdemeanors. So misdemeanors made up 90% of arrests in 2012. They made up less than 80% of arrests by 2021, right? So we're seeing this decline primarily in misdemeanor arrests. We're also seeing this decline primarily in nonviolent offenses. So what I'm showing you here is two things. The first thing I want you to see is the distribution of arrests over this entire time period based on what people are being arrested for. What we see here is that the two biggest categories are people being arrested when police are serving warrants and people being arrested for traffic violations. Those together make up more than half of all arrests. We see smaller numbers, but still significant numbers of arrests for drug crimes and for property crimes, with a very small number of arrests for violent crimes, right? Only 6% of arrests over this time period are for violent crimes. When we look at changes over time, what we can see is that the entire decline in arrests comes from traffic violations, from serving warrants, from drugs and societal crimes, right? We see no reduction. Actually, we see a slight increase in the number of arrests for violent crimes. We see a slight increase in the number of arrests for crimes against property. So when we think about this decline in arrests, this is about fewer people being pulled over, right, and arrested for traffic violations. It's about fewer warrants being served, fewer people being arrested for drug offenses. And again, this is very much in line with what's been happening in Los Angeles, right, in a much, much larger police department. Okay. Then lastly, we want to think about what's happening to police activity. Are we seeing the same sort of trends when we look at dispatches? Again, if we just look at what police are used for in South Pasadena, what we see is that about half of police dispatches are coded as extra patrol and administration. Our understanding of this is that this is essentially the way that police activity is described when police are sent to a particular area at the request of either the police department themselves or residents or commercial interests in an area, but not to respond to any particular incident. So that's about half of what the police dispatches do. The next largest is vehicle, right? This is people being pulled over. Of the remaining dispatches, the large majority are either nuisance. This is almost entirely reports of a suspicious person or other similarly vague, something amiss type calls, and property crimes. Less than 1% of all dispatches are for violent crimes or are for violent offenses. If we look at how dispatches have changed, right, where the small decline in dispatches are coming from, the category that's declined the most by far is vehicle-related dispatches, right? The South Pasadena police are pulling over fewer people than they did before. We see declines in the number of nuisance dispatches and property dispatches, just about in line with the overall decline in dispatches. And we see similar declines in the number of violent offenses or violent dispatches. You really can't see it here because they're so tiny, right? But they've also had declines that are proportional to the decline in dispatches overall. So, what we should be seeing here is, taking this all together, what we're seeing is that there's fewer traffic stops, fewer people being arrested for drug crimes, but no decline in arrests for violent crimes or crimes against property, despite the fact that the number of times that police are summoned for violent crimes or crimes against property has declined a little bit. The last thing I want to show you, in terms of, again, just understanding what the South Pasadena Police Department is doing, is the likelihood that each of these stops we've just gone through, all these dispatches we've just gone through, result in a serious arrest, by which I mean an arrest for a felony offense or an arrest for a violent crime. So what we just saw is that the vast majority of dispatches are for either extra patrol, vehicle-related offenses, or nuisances. If we look at those three types of dispatches, they are extremely unlikely to result in a felony arrest, and they're extremely unlikely to result in an arrest for a violent crime. The most common of those three, the type of dispatch most likely to result in one of these serious arrests is nuisance dispatches. And only about 1 in 300 nuisance dispatches are resulting in a felony arrest. Only about 1 in 300 are resulting in an arrest for a violent crime. So the large majority of what the South Pasadena Police Department is doing is very unlikely to result in a serious, a serious interaction with the public, right? Where someone's being arrested for a big crime. So this is the last thing that I want you to understand, right? Is that if we think about kind of the distribution of where the police department is spending their time, most of the police department's time is not being spent engaging in interactions that are likely to, involve violence. Even those small number of dispatches for violent offenses are relatively unlikely to result in an arrest, right? Only about 7% result in an arrest for a violent crime. Only about 3% result in an arrest for a felony. So just to sum up where we are so far, right, we've seen a significant decline in police activity, exactly in line with the Los Angeles Police Department. We've seen the decline coming primarily from less serious offenses, right, which is in keeping with changes in state policy over this time period, trying to reduce the use of arrests and incarceration for things like drug possession. We've seen that the city of South Pasadena has a much lower rate of violent arrests than does Los Angeles, despite having the same arrest rate. And we see that the majority of police dispatches are for activities that are very unlikely to result in an arrest for a felony or an arrest for a violent crime. Next thing I want to talk about, so we just talked about, right, what the police are doing. Next, I want to talk about who is being arrested by the police department. And I want to note that we can only talk about demographics of arrestees. We can't talk about the demographics of who's experiencing interaction with police departments, right? Who the police department is being summoned to, because the South Pasadena Police Department only provides demographics for people who are arrested. I also want to spend a minute, I'm generally trying to avoid getting you deep into the horrifying weeds of this data, but I do need to do that a little bit when it comes to the demographics of arrestees for the reason that Ella pointed out, which is that the data the South Pasadena Police Department provided to us did not differentiate between white and Hispanic arrestees. So, with the data that we received from the South Pasadena Police Department, that data indicated that 81% of arrestees were white and that there were no Hispanic arrestees. We wanted to understand whether Hispanic people were experiencing disproportionate rates of arrest in South Pasadena. So we tried to reconstruct the Hispanic ethnicity of South Pasadena arrestees on the basis of the surnames of arrested people. So the way that we did this, the US Census Bureau provides the list of the 1,000 most common last names in the United States, along with the race and ethnicity breakdown of those surnames. Right. So what we did is we said, we're going to assign someone a Hispanic ethnicity in our data if their surname, among people with their surname in the census, 70% or more identified themselves as Hispanic. So this is a process that is going to involve error on the part of an individual arrestee. Many of the people that we are going to identify through this process as being Hispanic are not actually going to be Hispanic. Many of the people who are in fact Hispanic will not be identified by our process as being Hispanic because they don't have a Hispanic last name. However, when we think about the statistical aggregates, this process is likely to have a very low rate of error. And I say this for two reasons. The first is that when we look in the census data, 91% of people with a surname that we coded as Hispanic identify themselves as Hispanic. So that means that of the people who we say are Hispanic, probably about 9% are not actually Hispanic. Likewise, 90% of Hispanic respondents to the census have one of the surnames that we code as Hispanic. So again, we're probably missing, 10% of the people we say are not Hispanic are likely to be Hispanic. If we think that the likelihood of someone's name being name not matching their ethnicity is uncorrelated across people in our data, which I think is a reasonable assumption, we can use those two numbers to get at a confidence interval, right? A likely lower bar and upper bar for what percentage of arrestees are Hispanic. And doing this tells us that we're probably within 1.5% above or below, with a confidence of about 99.9%. So individuals, likely we have individuals who are misclassified, but the big picture finding here that more than 50% of people arrested by the South Pasadena Police Department are Hispanic is very likely to be true. So with that data digression out of the way, let's talk a little bit more about what we actually see. So what we see here, as I mentioned before, is that Black and Hispanic residents in South Pasadena are arrested at highly disproportionate rates, right? About 20% of residents in South Pasadena are Hispanic. 54% of arrestees in South Pasadena are Hispanic. About 3% of residents are Black. 12% of people arrested by the South Pasadena Police Department are Black, right? And of course, along with this disproportionate rate of arrest for Black and Hispanic individuals, we see a lower rate of arrest than we'd expect based on the population for white and Asian individuals. Now, I want to make a really important note about this rate of disproportionality. Well, actually, two notes. The first note I want to make about this is that while we see disproportionate rates of arrest for Black and Hispanic individuals across the region, this rate of disproportionality is significantly higher than what we saw in Los Angeles. It's significantly higher than what we saw in Glendale, despite Glendale having demographics that are fairly similar to South Pasadena. Right, so this is a notable difference between the population of South Pasadena and the people arrested by the SPPD. The other thing that I want to note is that with the information we have, right, we can describe the disproportionality. We cannot tell you where this is coming from. So we don't know based on our data, we can't know based on our data, how much of these discrepancies are a consequence of discrimination on the part of police officers, right, who might be more likely to arrest someone who's Black or Hispanic than someone who's white or Asian doing the same activities. How much of this is due to differences in activity between Black and Hispanic versus white and Asian residents in South Pasadena, and how much is a result of some people who are arrested by the South Pasadena Police Department not living in South Pasadena, right, and potentially the demographics of people present in South Pasadena differing from residents. I should note this third possibility I don't think is likely to account for very much because the demographics of South Pasadena aren't dramatically different from the demographics of surrounding areas. So we see this very significant disparity, right, between the population and the people who are arrested by the South Pasadena Police Department. We also see that these disparities have not been decreasing over time. The percentage of arrestees who are Black or Hispanic is very similar in 2021 as it was in 2012. And similarly, the percent of arrestees who are white or Asian. We've seen a slight decline in the percentage of arrestees who are Hispanic, a slight increase in the percentage of arrestees who are Black. But we're not seeing these discrepancies close over time. The last thing that I want to say about these racial disparities is that these racial disparities are not consistent across reasons for arrest. And in fact, if we look at the percentage of arrestees who are white or Asian being arrested for violent crime, those percentages are a lot higher than for nonviolent crime. Right? I said before that overall 27% of arrestees are white. If we look only at violent crime, it's 40% of arrestees, right? Which is exactly in line with the population of South Pasadena. Likewise, 5% of all arrestees are Asian, but for violent crimes, that's 9%, right? Almost twice as high. So we see much larger disparities when it comes to nonviolent crimes than when it comes to violent crimes, right? And for Hispanic arrestees, this is reversed, right? The percentage of arrestees for violent crimes who are Hispanic is considerably lower than for arrestees overall. Similarly, right, we see very high percentages of traffic violations, of arrests targeting Hispanic individuals for traffic violations, and a high percentage of arrests for property crime targeting Black individuals. So what are our main takeaways in terms of demographics of arrestees? I think the most important thing is regardless of where we think these disparities come from, we can conclude that decisions about policing in South Pasadena are going to have a disproportionate impact on Black and Hispanic residents of South Pasadena because Black and Hispanic residents are being arrested at a high rate relative to the rest of the population. Right. The other thing that we can say is that these nonviolent offenses, where there's the most policy, right, there's the most room for policy in terms of how a nonviolent offense is dealt with, are where we see the largest racial disparities in arrests. The last thing that I want to show you, and then we can open things up to discussion, is I want to show you a little bit of information about where arrests are taking place within the city of South Pasadena. So the data that we got from the police department included two pieces of location information. For each arrest, they included the common name, right, or the colloquial name of the place where an arrest took place. They also provided the street address. I should note that the street addresses they provided us with were absolutely incredibly messy, very difficult to use, as was a lot of the data. But these place names were relatively straightforward. So the first thing that we did is we said, well, what are the places that are seeing the most number of arrests over time? And what we're seeing is across all the years of our data, Vaughn's grocery store is the #1 place where, I'm sorry, this isn't arrest, this is dispatches, right? So the #1 place where police are being summoned in South Pasadena is Vaughn's grocery store. 3.5% of all police dispatches in South Pasadena over this time period are for Vaughn's grocery store. We see high numbers of dispatches for a few other grocery store. Yeah. Okay, so the question for those on Zoom was, are the police going to Vaughn's a lot because there are a lot of middle and high school kids go to Vaughn's? That's definitely possible. That's definitely possible. You can see the 10th most common location is actually the high school. So I think it is possible that there are more events happening at Vaughn's because it's frequented by middle and high school kids. I actually didn't know that about Vaughn's, but now I know where to hang out. But no, that's absolutely a possibility. It's possible that there's more stuff happening at Vaughn's, and so therefore the people at Vaughn's call the police more often. It's also possible that Vaughn's calls the police more often than other grocery stores for similar things. Based on the data we have, there's really no way for me to tell, but you guys probably have a better sense than I do about what might be happening. No, that's a great question. So yeah, we see that Vaughn's has a really high number of arrests. We see similarly pavilions, about 1% of dispatches happen at pavilions, and a little less happen at Rite Aid. So these kind of big commercial establishments account for a pretty large share of dispatches. The other places where we see a lot of activity are in the parks, right? Arroyo Park and Garfield Park both account for a large number of dispatches, at the Gold Line station, right? And then at the library and the high school. So we're seeing a lot of police activity concentrated in a relatively small number of places. The next thing that we did when it comes to the location of police activity is we focused specifically on that 14% of all dispatches for nuisances. We focused on nuisances for a few reasons. The first is, as I mentioned before, the actual address information we got was very messy. So we didn't have the capacity to successfully clean all of the dispatch records that we had. We wanted to focus in on something we could handle. However, the other reason is that we think that nuisance dispatches are particularly important. What it means to have a nuisance dispatch, as I mentioned before, is that police are being called for a suspicious person, a disturbance, right? A suspicious circumstances, suspicious person and vehicle, et cetera. These are very open-ended, very vague descriptions of a situation where there's a lot of room for the people making the complaint to the police and for the police to respond to these either as a serious offense or not as a serious offense. There's a lot of flexibility in what a nuisance dispatch means. This is probably the type of dispatch where there's the most room for scope for policy, right? And so what we wanted to understand here is where are these nuisance dispatches occurring throughout South Pasadena? Do we see these centered in particular neighborhoods, particular types of neighborhoods? What we actually saw is that the areas in the city that have, so what these maps are showing you, these blue blobs are essentially the number of dispatches happening in each census block, right? Each census block group has a similar number of people in it. So the areas with big blue blobs are the areas with the most nuisance dispatches. What we're seeing is that these are really centered on the commercial corridors, right? They're centered on Mission Street and then on Fair Oaks, and I'm forgetting the name of the street next to Fair Oaks, but you guys probably know it. If we look just at residential areas, we didn't see any notable patterns in terms of nuisance dispatches happening at higher rates in more affluent neighborhoods or the racial demographics of neighborhoods associating with the number of nuisance dispatches. So overall, what have we learned here? I think the first thing to note is, again, that policing practices have a disproportionate impact on Black and Hispanic individuals, residents and non-residents of South Pasadena. We also want to note that we're in a policy environment here where South Pasadena Police Department has reduced the number of arrests it makes every year considerably by more than half. But South Pasadena is continuing to arrest the same number of people per capita as Los Angeles, despite having a much lower rate of violent crime, right? Having fewer than half as many arrests for violent crime as the city of Los Angeles. And then the last thing that we want to note is that a disproportionate share of police activity is happening in a handful of commercial areas throughout the city. Okay, so this is what I have. Again, I want to thank everyone involved with this project. I want to thank our wonderful student researchers, my fantastic co-authors, Diego Roniansky, and the entire team at Care First South Pasadena. And I think now we can open it up to questions, both for people on Zoom and for those of you who are here in person.
Is there any requirement from either our city, our police department, any oversight, anything that requires them to gather, synthesize, and analyze this data on a regular basis? Or is it our job to call professors and be like, please help?
That's a fantastic question. I think one of the things that has really struck us in doing this work is how inaccessible data are, particularly from smaller police departments and suburban police departments. The data that we analyzed here are being produced by computer systems. It would not be difficult to put all of this data online for anyone to look at, and that hasn't happened. In answer to your question about are there requirements, the answer is that there are national requirements going into place in the next few years, requiring all police departments kind of with the start year, depending on the size of the police department, requiring police departments to start recording information about stops in order to make it easier for researchers to look for evidence of racial disparities in police practices. But I think despite these reporting requirements that are going into place that are going to require South Pasadena to update their systems, right, and keep better track of what they're doing, I think there's absolutely scope for the police to produce more data on a regular basis and make that data available to the public in a more routine way. Because I absolutely agree with you. This shouldn't come down, right? This sort of processing that we did should not come down to individuals or community members doing Freedom of Information Act requests and pulling this together ourselves. Yes. So the question was, did we look at policy changes over time in what the criteria are for whether to make an arrest? That is a great question. So there have been important state policy changes over this time period. The most important is probably Prop 47, which downgraded most drug possession offenses and property thefts for small amounts of money from felonies to misdemeanors. The state policies did not tell cities or police departments when they can or cannot make arrests because they did not make anything legal that was previously illegal. What they did do is they reduced the penalties that prosecutors can give on the basis of some arrests. So in terms of state policy, the answer is there is a shift in the state policy environment that was intended to encourage police departments to arrest fewer people, but those policies don't require police departments to arrest fewer people. And in fact, what we saw in Glendale is that the Glendale police didn't arrest any fewer people. They continued to arrest exactly the same number of people throughout this entire time period. Now, when it comes to the South Pasadena Police Department in particular, we haven't been able to find any information from the South Pasadena Police Department about their protocols or their training for officers about when to arrest. The South Pasadena Police Department does describe itself as using a community policing model. And I would love to hear from the South Pasadena Police Department about what has happened in order to cause these changes in arrests, but we haven't received any of that information. Okay, so first of all, thank you for that information about the city's policies. That sounds very interesting. And it would be really interesting, as you're saying, to look at whether the changes in arrest rates we're seeing here correspond to changes in the manual. When it comes to the second question, oh, and I'm sorry for the people on Zoom. The first part of the question was noting that the city does have training manuals available that specify their criteria for arrest, and that at least there's some possibility that their current policy is that they will only make an arrest if they witness a felony. The second part, although they can also make an arrest at the request of a citizen, is that correct? That's your understanding, exactly. So we're hoping we're correct about this. And then the second part was, yes, if the data that we have can tell whether how an individual officer made a determination about whether to make an arrest. So unfortunately, the data that we have can't tell us how an individual officer made a determination because the dispatch records we have, the media log, doesn't tell us which officer was involved in any particular case. So we're not able to, for example, see whether some officers are more likely to arrest for certain offenses than others. The media logs also provide very little information about the situations themselves. All that we really have are these categories that we showed you of, right, this was a dispatch for suspicious activity. We don't know anything about what that suspicious activity actually was. I think that what a person would need to do to do what you're talking about, right, try to determine the process by which the facts of a case result in an arrest or don't result in an arrest, is they would need to have access to the police reports themselves, which would provide more detailed information about what happened in each of these incidents. But thank you, those are fantastic questions. Yes. So you're talking about this extra patrol and enforcement category.
Yeah.
So we don't have very much information about the extra patrol and enforcement dispatches. Our understanding of these are that these are requests for extra patrols. My guess is that the situation that you're describing, where you have a person who's locked themselves in a bathroom and the police are called to take the person out of the bathroom, would be more likely to result in a nuisance dispatch because that might be categorized as a disturbance. But this is what we would really love is to sit down with the police department and go over this data with them to help understand these internal protocols. So this is really our best guess about what these codes mean.
Okay.
Yes. The question was for these dispatches for suspicious persons or suspicious persons in cars, are we able to see whether those are related to our unhoused neighbors? We've done some work to try to figure out what police activity is targeting unhoused individuals. From the dispatch records, we really don't know. There's no way for us to tell. What we've tried to do is look at the actual charge codes for arrests and look at charges that, so the LAPD actually includes information on their arrest records, which are all public, about whether the person arrested was unhoused. So we have done some work to try to identify charge codes that are most commonly associated with unhoused individuals. These are things like stealing shopping carts, loitering, trespass, etc., and trying to see where those arrests take place. However, because there's a small number of arrests in South Pasadena, this gives us a very small snapshot of police activity in South Pasadena, and we haven't pursued that very far. But with the data that we have now, because the police are not telling us who's unhoused in the data, that's really the only thing that we can do. That's a great question. Yeah.
One, if you noticed any difference in the quality of the data from, say, the last 12 months to the prior period?
So okay, sorry. The question is, do we have a difference in quality of the data over the last 12 months relative to the prior period? The only difference over time is that we have these dispatch records, these media reports starting in late 2016. But what we were provided was image PDF files with exactly the same formatting over the entire time period we had the data. So there was no difference at all in data quality over that time period. Nothing that we could identify.
From the arrest records, did you notice any trends or patterns by specific officers?
So the question was whether we saw trends or patterns by specific officers in our arrest records. We would love to know whether we saw that, but we don't know which officers made each arrest. I think the only information that the city has been able to or willing to release on individual officers is annual overtime, but you can't connect annual overtime to anything that happened on a particular day. So as much as we would love, and again, big city police departments often do release this data, right? And do record this data that can tell you what officer was assigned to what part of the city on what day. As much as we would love to have that data and understand individual officers' actions, what we've been given by the city is not sufficient to do that. Great questions. Yes. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, this is probably easier. Okay, so question number one was, do we know what's happened to the number of police officers over time? This is something I think Care First has looked more deeply than we have on this. If I remember correctly, the number of officers hasn't changed, and the police budget has actually increased, right?
The officers have changed.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
But nothing substantial.
So there has not been a significant decrease in the number of officers. Yeah, but then those are numbers we have that we can get. We should. Yeah. Yeah. So the second question was, is there a way for us to connect our data on arrests to data on prosecutions? That is something that we've been looking into. In order to do this, the information on prosecutions would not rest with the police department. The information on prosecutions would rest with the district attorney's office. So our community partners in Glendale, and I think you guys too, have looked into filing Freedom of Information Act requests that would give us the information on prosecutions. So far, we've not been successful in getting those information. Were we to get that information, I think we would be able to connect it to this, because the data we have here includes the person's name. It includes the charges under which they were arrested. It includes the date of arrest. That should be sufficient to link people's arrest records to their prosecution records and do precisely what you're saying, right? That would allow us to ask questions like, what percentage of arrests are actually even leading to prosecution? Are there differences by race in the likelihood that an arrest leads to prosecution, which would be a good indication of whether there are differences by race in essentially the threshold at which an officer is making an arrest? Fantastic questions with a disappointing answer. Yeah, that's a great question. So the question was, I'm sorry, what's your name? So John is concerned about the number of these dispatches for suspicious persons or suspicious circumstances, and is concerned that this is so subjective, it's likely to involve a lot of racial profiling. Asked whether we know how many of those calls originated through the Neighborhood Watch program. So unfortunately, we don't know which of these dispatches were citizen initiated versus department initiated, and we don't know who made any of the calls. One thing that we could potentially do, because we have the addresses for these calls, is, and this is local knowledge I don't have, but if the Neighborhood Watch has only been in operation in particular areas or at particular times, we could potentially look to see whether there are more of these calls when Neighborhood Watches are operational than when they're not in neighboring areas. And that would be an interesting thing to do. So this question was going back to the bonds being responsible for 3.5% of all the dispatches. Is there any discussion about having this done by private security hired by these establishments rather than being done on the taxpayer dime. I don't think that I'm the right person to field this question, but I know that in Care First's materials around this report, this is something that you guys discussed. Does anyone want to take this?
Just from the backseat. Yes, we've considered that, that's a policy change that Care First will be advocating for, is to take public policing out of private commercial establishments. So exactly to your point, John.
So in case people on Zoom didn't hear, the answer is that Care First is actively working on a policy change to take private policing out, or public policing out of private establishments, and to require a place like Vaughn's to hire their own security. Great question. Thank you. The question was, can we see the underlying data to understand why we can't get this more granular information? And with a follow-up that it's almost certain that the city has this information somewhere. Yeah, I can show you. So I do want to show you the underlying data. I think that's a great idea. I'm going to futz with it a second because I want to mask the individual names before flashing somebody's arrest record onto. So we have individual data on individual arrests and data on individual dispatches. Those data do not have very many fields. So they don't have information about the arresting officer, for example. To your point, I am sure that the arrest records themselves that are filed by police officers have the information about who made the arrest and what the circumstances were connected to that arrest. The information that we've been given is an arrest log. So the arrest log is much more limited. It basically just tells us that an arrest occurred, where the arrest occurred, the time and date the arrest occurred, and who was arrested. I can absolutely show you the dispatch records. Yeah, this is what these look like. So this is all that we know, right? Is we have basically this information about, this is what we're using to determine what the stop's about, right? We know the address where the stop took place. We know the date, and we have this ID number, which we can use to link the dispatches to the arrest records. And that's what we know about dispatches. For the arrest records, just give me 1 second. I'm going to mask the names and then pull this up to show you. But for the arrest records, what we have is we have ID number of the arrest. We have the name of the person arrested, indication of their race, their date of birth, their sex, the date they were arrested, whether it was a misdemeanor or a felony, the charges. And that's it. That's what we know. Just a scan of a piece of paper. Yeah. So for those of you on Zoom, what we're hearing is that they absolutely have proper dispatch records that they probably should have provided in response to this Freedom of Information Act request, but those were not provided. So we've processed what we were able to get out of them, and I absolutely agree with you. There's likely to be more information stored on their servers. Oh gosh, that's a great question. Oh, I have this in the report. Yeah, this is in the report.
No, they only had
Only 2017. Yeah.
10 years of arrest reports in 5 years.
Right. 118,000. Yes. But if they gave us 118,000 PDFs, we would process 118,000 PDFs. So, if you have ideas for how to help get that information out, that would be very, very interesting. Yes, that's a great question. So the question was, how would I characterize the information system in South Pasadena for the police data relative to other police departments that we've worked with or we've seen data from? So we've seen data from 3 other police departments now. There's the publicly available data from the LAPD. We've received similarly through FOIA's data from Glendale, and we just received through FOIA data from Pasadena, the city of Pasadena. Of those, I would say definitely the South Pasadena data that we received was the worst, not necessarily in terms of the detail so the amount of information provided to us about each arrest is the same as what we got in Glendale, and is similar to what is available in Pasadena. Pasadena provides a little bit more information than the other 2 cities. The quality of the information systems itself is considerably worse in South Pasadena, in that what we got is scans of physical pieces of paper. The Care First team worked with the city in the police department. We did not, in terms of getting different data. My understanding is that you guys were told that was all that they could provide, that they didn't have a way of going into their own computer systems to get older records.
Yeah, we asked for the raw file.
Yeah.
We got that to scan.
So that's something the other police departments we've interacted with have been able to provide us files coming from the actual data systems from which these PDFs were generated. In Glendale, for example, we found out what files they had by going on their website and seeing PDFs. They were able to provide us with Excel files that came from their actual information systems. Yes.
I'm just gonna repeat back what you just said because it's really, if I understand correctly, it doesn't make any sense. So you're saying the data that you use is stored in a digital information system by the SPPD, but the data that was given through FOIA was literally scanned pieces of paper, so they went through a digital system, printed out all these pieces of paper, and then scanned them to you?
I mean, we definitely, this was the thing that we went back and forth with them about so many times. Like, surely there's a way for you to give us a usable format. Any of these, number of formats would be fine. And they just said, nope, this is what we have. This is how we submitted to the California Department of Justice, and we can't give it to you any other way.
But they use a digital,
yes,
they use a digital system?
Yes. But they have recently changed systems. So because of RIPA, they actually have to record data about stops now, and they completely switched over to a new IT system. And evidently it will be easier going forward to get this information in a useful format.
Yes.
This is what we charge.
That was my question. Was the data any better in the last 12 months?
Right, we don't have it from the new
Yeah.
system. They've implemented that more recently.
Yeah.
And just for a point of reference, LAPD was under the federal oversight for 10 years.
Yes.
They had to invest in that software a lot.
Precisely. I think so. So the comment made was that LAPD was under federal oversight for 10 years. That's why they've had to invest in this better software. That's exactly right. The reason that the LAPD has higher quality publicly available data than the other police departments in the area is because they're under significantly more scrutiny than any of the other police departments in the area, both as a result of their size and as a result of many high profile incidents. So that's exactly right. It's not surprising that a smaller city is going to have both less oversight and potentially less extensive IT systems than a very, very large city. But yeah, this is the process, the system that this is what we were able to be given. The data clearly was originally in a computer database, but what they were able to provide us was scanned pieces of paper. Yeah.
In analyzing the data, did you come up with any patterns of time of day or day of week?
We did look at this. We didn't see anything. We didn't see, in terms of day of week, we didn't see anything surprising. We also looked a little bit at day of month to see whether there was evidence of arrests happening, at a point when an arrest quota was being met or something like this. We didn't see anything there. So we didn't see anything surprising. Again, thank you all so much for your attention. It's been a real pleasure to share this with you. I'm very happy to talk more with any of you if you have further questions or ideas.
Thank you so much, Jordan. This is very informative. And as he said, we're in the weeds of data, but also this is daily life for a lot of folks. So it's important to back up the stories that we hear, the experiences that people have with the math. Now, I want to introduce another special guest that we have, Joshua Parr from the LA County Human Relations Commission.
I'll just introduce myself really quick. First, I want to say thank you, Professor. It's a hard talk to follow. But I'm coming from the Los Angeles County Commission on Human Relations, which has been around since '43. And what we are is a very small part of the county. And we've been looking at police oversight and police relations in the county since really, the Zoot Suit riots back in 1943. And we've seen a cycle of civil unrest that's happened in LA County that's always been sparked by police abuse in many cases. And so we've looked at those, the kind of core conditions that create that. And I'm here today, thanks to Helen and Ellen, by the way, who invited this organization to come and speak. And I don't have too much to say. I do want to talk about the data sets, though, that you guys have created. We are figuring out where to put that on our websites. And so it'll be publicly accessible to anyone who wants to kind of crunch numbers or take a look at that. We're still figuring out where we are going to put that. We are also going to continue to kind of fund this type of work in small mini grants because we see the need for it. Absolutely. The LAPD has quite a bit of oversight. The sheriff's is coming into place, but the smaller departments don't. And the level of scrutiny will increase as these kinds of reports and data collection increases. And so we're going to be starting to do that a bit more. And this is really a great first run. It's really a great model. And so I really appreciate having the time to be working with all of you guys and collaborating with everyone who is part of this community and wants oversight and wants justice. So that's really all I have to say. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua. And thank you for everyone who's here and everyone on Zoom. I believe this concludes our presentation. And if you want to find more information about us, please go to carefirst.southpasadena.com or find us on Instagram at Care First South Pass. Thanks.